In 1979, a small Central American nation became the center of a global struggle over power, justice, and the Cold War. After more than 40 years of dictatorship, the people of Nicaragua rose up and overthrew one of Latin America's longest ruling regimes. This event is known as the Nicaraguan Revolution, and it transformed the country's politics, society, and relationship with the world. In this presentation, we will explore what caused the revolution, who was involved, how it unfolded, and how historians have studied the revolution since the fighting has stopped. This map can help you place Nicaragua within Latin America, above Costa Rica and below Honduras, with the Pacific Ocean to the west and the Caribbean Sea to the east. For most of the 20th century, Nicaragua was controlled by the Somoza family. Beginning in 1936, three generations of the family ruled the country like a personal business. At the time of the revolution, Anastasio Somoza Debayle was president. Anastasia is pictured here along with his older brother Luis and their father Anastasio Somoza Garcia, who were the previous Nicaraguan leaders from the Somoza family. The Somoza family controlled land, banks, industries, and the military. Elections existed, but they were rigged. Opposition voices were censored, jailed, or even killed. While the Somozas grew extremely wealthy, most Nicaraguans lived in poverty. Large landowners held the best farmland while peasants struggled to survive. A major turning point came in 1972 when a powerful earthquake destroyed the capital city, Manuega. Thousands of people were killed, and many important economic and administrative buildings were destroyed, which you can see in this image. International aid poured in, but much of it was stolen by government officials. This corruption angered people across social classes and made it clear to many Nicaraguans that reform within the system wasn't possible. Opposition to the Somoza dictatorship had existed for years, but one group eventually united the resistance. That group was the Sandinista National Liberation Front, or Frente Sandinista de Liberación Nacional, aka the FSLN. Founded in 1961, the Sandinistas were named after Augusto Cesar Sandino, a nationalist leader who had fought against U.S. military occupation in Nicaragua in the 1920s, and is pictured in the bottom corner here. The FSLN believed in ending the Somoza dictatorship, reducing inequality, redistributing land, and limiting foreign control over Nicaragua. Over time, their members included students, workers, peasants, and later even business leaders and church groups. You can see one of their protests in the photo here. The FSLN became the unifying political group that opposed the Somoza dictatorship. Pedro Joaquin Chamorro, pictured here, was a leading journalist who opposed the Somoza regime in his newspaper. He was assassinated in 1978, resulting in an explosion of public outrage. Nationwide strikes, protests, and armed resistance pushed the country towards full-scale revolution. The very public assassination convinced moderates that peaceful opposition would not work in overthrowing the Somoza regime, and the numbers within the FSLN grew. While the opposition movement grew and united within Nicaragua, there were also international condemnation for the violent actions by the Somoza government. By 1978, Nicaragua was in a full-scale civil war. Sandinista guerrilla forces fought the National Guard in cities and rural areas. Many civilians supported the rebels by providing shelter, food, and information. You can see two images of the Sandinista guerrilla forces here. At the same time, international pressure on the Somoza regime increased. The U.S., a longtime ally of the Somozas, began distancing itself due to human rights abuses. In July 1979, the final offensive began. Sandinista forces advanced across the country while huge popular uprisings erupted in major cities. Facing collapse, Anastasio Somoza Debayle, the last dictator, fled Nicaragua on July 17, 1979. 2 days later, Sandinista fighters entered the capital Manuega, declaring victory. The Somoza dynasty was over. After the revolution, the Sandinistas formed a new government called the Junta of National Reconstruction. They promised democracy, social justice, and national independence. Some of their early reforms included land redistribution to peasants, nationalization of banks and key industries, a massive literacy campaign, and expanded access to healthcare and education. You can see a propaganda poster here in support of the education reform, claiming literacy is the path led by Sandino, literacy is liberation, free Nicaragua. Many Nicaraguans felt hopeful for the first time in decades. The revolution had inspired people across the world who saw it as a victory for the poor and oppressed, but the challenges were far from over. Nicaragua's revolution quickly became part of the Cold War. The Sandinistas developed close ties with Cuba and the Soviet Union, which alarmed the U.S. In the early 1980s, under President Reagan, the U.S. supported armed rebel groups known as the Contras, who opposed the Sandinista government. This led to a long and brutal civil war, especially in rural areas. The fighting caused tens of thousands of deaths, severe economic damage, food shortages, and displacement of rural populations. Many protested against the U.S. for this involvement, as seen in this photo. By the end of the decade, war fatigue and economic hardship outweighed revolutionary optimism. In 1990, after years of civil war and economic hardship, Nicaragua held democratic elections. An opposition coalition led by Violeta Chamorro, widow of the previously assassinated journalist Pedro Joaquin Chamorro, won the election. You can see the election results map and Violeta in the images here. The Sandinistas lost, and power peacefully transferred to a new government, ending the revolutionary period. Despite this election loss, the Sandinistas still held some political influence and were able to regain elected power in 2006, and have had a mixed reputation since then under President Daniel Ortega. The legacy of the Nicaraguan Revolution is complex. It overthrew a brutal dictatorship and expanded education and political participation. But years of war, economic struggle, and later political conflicts complicated its goals. Even today, the revolution remains a powerful symbol representing both hope for change and warnings about power, conflict, and foreign involvement. A modern FSLN protest is pictured here to show the political influence the group still has in Nicaragua. When historians study the Nicaraguan Revolution, they are not just asking what happened. They're asking why it happened, how it worked, who mattered most, and what kind of revolution it really was. Over the past 40 years, scholars have debated whether the Nicaraguan Revolution should be understood primarily as a social revolution, a national uprising, a Cold War proxy conflict, or a case shaped by strategic agency rather than structural inevitability. The major historiographical emphasis surrounding the revolution has changed over time, from early structural explanations to a focus on agency, culture, religion, and international networks, and finally to newer global and transnational interpretations. Early scholarly interpretations, especially those written in the 1980s, tended to explain the Nicaraguan Revolution through structural conditions. Works like Munas Amar's 1984 study framed the revolution as a response to long-term socioeconomic inequality, authoritarian repression, and the U.S. support for the Somoza dynasty. In this view, the revolution emerged because Nicaragua exhibited classic conditions associated with revolution: poverty, elite concentration of land, state violence, and the collapse of regime legitimacy. This approach aligns loosely with social revolution models, which emphasize structural crisis and systemic breakdowns rather than individual choices. The Sandinistas in this framework appear as the vehicle of underlying forces more than decisive actors themselves. However, critics later argued that these explanations leaned heavily towards determinism, treating the revolution as almost inevitable while minimizing the decisions made by revolutionary leaders and ordinary participants. Amar is pictured at the top here. One of the most influential historiographical interventions came from Phil Ryan's 2000 article, Structure, Agency in the Nicaraguan Revolution. Ryan directly challenged structuralist explanations, arguing that many structural conditions were actively produced and managed by political actors, especially the Sandinistas. For example, economic crises were intensified or exploited strategically. Revolutionary unity was carefully constructed across class lines, and peasant support did not naturally arise but required organization and persuasion. Ryan does not reject structure entirely. Instead, he argues that agency and structure are inseparable. Revolutionary actors operate within structures, but they also reshape them. This reframing was significant because it repositioned the Sandinistas from passive beneficiaries of collapse to strategic political actors, a move that influenced much later scholarship. Ryan is pictured at the bottom here. Another major shift in historiography moved away from state centered explanations towards cultural and social mobilization. Ren Close's 2012 article on radical Christians and liberation theology challenged both Marxist and structural models by arguing that religion was not a conservative obstacle, but a revolutionary catalyst. Close shows how liberation theology transformed political consciousness, enabling ordinary Christians to reconcile faith with armed struggle. This directly contests explanations that treat ideology as imposed from elites or determined by class position alone. This history from below approach restores agency to non elite actors, peasants, religious leaders, lay activists, and local communities whose motivations cannot be explained purely by economics or geopolitics. In doing so, it complicates social revolution models that privilege class conflict while sidelining belief systems and moral frameworks. Close is pictured at the top here. Cold War interpretations form another major line of disagreement. Earlier scholarship often portrayed Nicaragua as a victim of U.S. intervention, emphasizing external constraints and imperial domination. However, Hager and Snyder's 2015 article offers a sharp revisionist challenge. They argue that the Sandinista leadership actively provoked confrontation with the United States, not out of miscalculation, but as a strategic choice to radicalize the revolution and pursue internationalist goals. This interpretation shifts responsibility away from Washington alone and places it squarely on Sandinista ideology agency. Many scholars remain skeptical of this claim, arguing it underestimates U.S. hostility and regional power asymmetries. But the article is important because it exemplifies a broader historiographical trend, treating revolutionary governments as actors, not merely reactors. Snyder is pictured at the bottom here. More recent scholarship has moved beyond US centric frameworks altogether. Works by Tanya Harmer, Aline Van Amen, David Johnson Lee, and Hector Perella argue that the Nicaraguan Revolution must be understood as deeply international, but not simply in superpower terms. Key contributions of this internationalizing turn include Van Amen's demonstration that revolutionary diplomacy was central to Sandinista survival. Perella's reframing of U.S. solidarity movements as transnational collaborations instead of foreign appendages, and Lee's analysis of pluralism and development discourse as arenas of struggle rather than neutral ideals. These scholars argue that Nicaragua was embedded in networks of activists, diplomats, churches, European states, and global South actors. This challenges earlier Cold War binaries and undermines social revolution models that treat revolution as internally bounded events. Van Amen and Perla are pictured in the top two photos here. The most recent historiographical works, such as Hilary Francis's edited volume on Nicaraguan exceptionalism, asks not what the revolution was, but how it has been remembered and contested. Rather than seeking a single interpretation, this scholarship emphasizes competing memories, gendered experiences, cultural narratives, and ongoing political use of the revolution. This marks a departure from earlier attempts to categorize the revolution definitively. Instead, historians increasingly treat the Sandinista experience as plural, contingent, and even unresolved. Francis is pictured at the bottom here. One of the most important causes of the Nicaraguan Revolution was mass frustration among the population. For decades, Nicaragua was ruled by the Somoza family dictatorship. Power and wealth were tightly concentrated in the hands of one family and a small elite, while most citizens lived in poverty. Political opposition was repressed, elections were manipulated, and corruption was widespread. By the 1970s, frustration spread across multiple social classes. Peasants were angry about land inequality, urban workers faced unemployment and inflation, middle class professionals resented corruption and lack of political voice. Even business leaders grew tired of Somoza's monopolization of wealth. What made the revolution especially powerful was that these groups unified around shared motivations, removing the dictatorship, restoring dignity, and achieving national independence. Meanwhile, much of the international community stood idle. Although aware of Somoza's repression, foreign governments, especially the US, continued to support the regime until its collapse was unavoidable. This lack of effective external intervention reinforced the belief among Nicaraguans that change could only come from within. The Nicaraguan Revolution can be classified as a peasant revolution, though not a purely rural one. Peasants played a critical role in the uprising by providing fighters, offering food, shelter, and intelligence, and supporting guerrilla warfare in the countryside. However, unlike some peasant revolutions, Nicaragua's uprising involved a mixed socioeconomic coalition. Rural peasants worked alongside students, workers, clergy, and even segments of the middle class. This combination distinguishes the Nicaraguan case study and makes it hard to fit within other types of revolution. The revolution was rooted in rural discontent, but it succeeded because it bridged divisions between countryside and city. The Sandinistas were able to unite these groups by framing the struggle as both social and national, not just class based. You can see another image from the FSLN protests here. The Nicaraguan Revolution fits within two major revolutionary theories. First, Marxist theory. The Sandinistas embraced socialist ideals such as redistribution of land, economic equality, opposition to capitalist exploitation, and solidarity with workers and peasants. While Nicaragua was not an industrial society in the Marxist sense, the revolution still reflected a classic Marxist conflict between a wealthy ruling elite and the masses. Second, structural theory, especially as proposed by Theda Skopel and Ellen Trimberger. Structural theorists argue that revolutions are primarily political, not spontaneous explosions of anger. This occurs when the state loses legitimacy, elite unity collapses, and the government can no longer maintain control. This was all evident in Nicaragua with the collapse of support for the Somoza regime, as well as when state institutions failed to respond to crisis like the 1972 earthquake. From this perspective, the revolution was less about ideology alone and more about state breakdown, with the Sandinistas positioned to seize power. When compared to other major revolutions, the Nicaraguan Revolution shows both similarities and differences. Like the French Revolution, it emerged from deep social inequality and elite privilege. However, Nicaragua lacked the same revolutionary terror and mass restructuring of political institutions. A painting of the French Revolution is on the top at the side. Like the Russian Revolution, it involved socialist ideology and the overthrow of an authoritarian regime. But unlike Russia, Nicaragua did not experience rapid industrial collapse or a central party seizure of power in a major empire. A pro Lenin propaganda poster from the Russian Revolution is in the middle of the images. The closest comparison is the Chinese Communist Revolution. Both were peasant based, led by guerrilla movements, focused on nationalism and social justice, and supported by broad rural participation. However, Nicaragua's revolution occurred within a Cold War global system, which placed far greater external pressure on the new regime than earlier revolutions experienced. A propaganda poster of the Chinese Revolution is at the bottom of the images. The Nicaraguan Revolution of 1979 reminds us that revolutions are not just moments, but long processes filled with victories, costs, and consequences. Historians continue to disagree about the Nicaraguan Revolution because it resists simple categories. Was it driven by structure or agency? Was it nationalist, socialist, or internationalist? Was its conclusion imposed from outside or shaped by choices made within? What the historiography makes clear is this: the Nicaraguan Revolution is no longer studied as an inevitable eruption or a failed experiment, but as a strategic, contested, and deeply human process. And that complexity is precisely why it remains so important to study.